West.
The drug had to be sterile because patients would have it injected into their joints or their spines to relieve chronic pain. What happened next is the worst pharmaceutical disaster in decades. The steroid was contaminated with fungus. This is the fungus. It is a sample that has been grown from the spinal fluid of a patient.
Reoccurring problems with mold and bacteria inside the lab, including an email that stated the discovery of, quote, more mold. The agent testified that Cadden and Chin knowingly skipped sterility testing, falsified documents, and shipped medication in 2011 that had been expired since 2007.
Jury's verdict today has Barry Cadden facing years, even decades in prison, but some victims feel he's gotten away with murder.
These people died. My husband died at his negligence.
Sharon Wingate speaking by Skype about today's verdict. Her husband Doug died after being injected with NECC steroids.
Yes, I believe he got away with murder. I believe this is a slap on the hand for him.
I got my life back now. Now I can enjoy every day that I live. I can really enjoy myself. And before, even a good day was hell. I mean, I couldn't enjoy nothing. But now I can enjoy myself. That's when I say it's wonderful. I look at the future the same way a young guy, 25, 30-year-old would.
His biggest problem was he would sleep a lot. And I mean, he was at the point where could be sitting in here talking like I'm talking and fall right off to sleep while he was talking. I went to the point where I had to put his socks and shoes on, his clothes on, his shaving, wash his hair, look out at him just like you would look out at a 2 or 3-year-old. He said, I'm in so much pain, I've got to have that pain medicine. He said, I just cannot live without that pain medicine.
People would look at him and literally think, well, he's got to be drunk or he's got to be high on something. They didn't know, he was just on a lot of medicine.
It's not his problem. The clinic and the doctor can't control a patient if they go home and do something stupid.
They just cared about money.
I think when I first started, I was on 20 milligrams in the morning and 20 in the evening. And it worked. It worked.
Since I've been on this new pain medication, I have not missed one day of work, and my boss really appreciates that. Lauren is there every day. So I'm able to be very productive, person again, which is really great.
Eventually, it stopped working, and it got increased. I think it was 40 in the morning and 40 in the evening. And then eventually that got increased. This went on for years. I lost my job and I lost my insurance. So it got to the point where I couldn't afford it, and I didn't buy it one time, and that was the beginning of the end for me, because I could no longer afford it. But the time that I went without it was probably the most unbelievable, excruciating, horrible time of my life. The withdrawals were just unbelievable. I just knew eventually I was, I'd probably kill myself, OD, taking this medicine. I would never take another OxyContin. You couldn't get me to take another OxyContin. Never again.
Physical therapy hopefully will get me strong enough where eventually I won't need to use the drug therapy, but the drug therapy allowed me to do the physical therapy, which in turn lowered my blood pressure and lowered the blood levels.
The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities.
Okay, so now on to the war on drugs, racist history behind it, the opioid crisis epidemic that's going on in the United States and all over the world, and the war on marijuana by Big Pharma and other, industries, the locking up of nonviolent offenders, in prison, etc. So here we go. So the decades-long international effort to suppress the illegal opium and heroin trade clearly hasn't worked, but that's not a problem for the U.S. drug lords, aka drug warriors. The goal of a free drug world is an elaborate deception. It is an illusion created by the United States Nation's Office on Drugs and Crime slogan promoting health, security, and justice. That the United States has declared war on drugs, and that the CIA has simultaneously promoted cocaine and heroin traffic for its own, aims and purposes. Shows deep contradictions in the U.S. drug policy, yet there is more of a connection between those two things than first meets the eye. There is an unelected and unaccountable multinational of counter-narcotics agencies led by the UNODC that have an ideological and material stake in continuing the war on drugs and consequently the drug trade. The United States wants and needs a non-stop war on drugs abroad as a pretext to invade a country just to take their resources, typical capitalist pigs, capitalism, the bankers want war, etc. That is the real but hidden agenda of the international war on drugs. It's not about the drugs. It's about how much money can Porky make. So, yeah. Big Pharma just cares about profits because that's what capitalism does. It puts money over human lives of anything, everything, every day. Big Pharma creates customers, not cures. Remember that slogan. From as far back as 1911 until the late 1990s, the use of opioids or narcotics was limited to very narrow circumstances such as post-surgical pain and end-of-life care. That's because the medical establishment and regulators were keenly aware of the addictive quality of the drugs at that time and the dangers of posed if they were misused by anyone or by customers. But that all changed when a school of thought started to take over in medicine beginning in the late 1990s, early 2000s, treating pain like a preeminent priority, and addiction was less of a concern to them. Pain was dubbed the fifth visual sign. Big Pharma played an important role on this transformation and made billions in the process. Now states, cities, countries, and other jurisdictions across the country and the world are fighting back with lawsuits and investigations, hoping to hold drug makers, aka evil Big Pharma, accountable for the collateral damage of the nation's opioid crisis as a whole, because they're the ones who created it. Big Pharma created the opioid crisis. Capitalist pigs did because they want to make money. The seeds of an epidemic were planted nearly 2 decades ago. With little or no valid clinical evidence to go on, the medical establishment began prescribing opioids for long-term chronic pain. Doctors and hospitals' ratings were even tied to how well they reduced patients' pain. The concept of pseudo addiction was created, encouraging doctors to treat patients with some signs of addiction by giving them even more opioids and even more highly addicted drugs. Potent narcotics started to flood the U.S. as sales skyrocketed. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the amount of prescription opioids sold to pharmacies, hospitals, and doctors' offices almost quadrupled between 1999 and 2014. The family that owns Purdue Pharma, the Shacklers, became one of the wealthiest families in the country, with a net worth that reached as high as $14 billion in 2015, largely on the strength of the opioid OxyContin profits. The family was ranked by Forbes to be among the top 20 richest in the U.S. in America. As the family and company's fortune rose, so did the suffering across the country and across the world. Between 1999 and 2015, approximately 183,000 Americans died from drug overdoses due to opioids. And opioid overdoses, 15,000 alone, happened in 2015. And over 70% of the 70,630 deaths in 2019 involved an opioid overdose. From 1999 through 2019, nearly 500,000 people died from an overdose involving any opioid, whether that is a prescription opioid or illicit opioids. Under the bankruptcy plan filed in 2021, late Monday night, the Purdue Pharma and the CEOs would pay roughly $500 million in cash to settle the hundreds of thousands of lawsuits and injury lawsuits, claims linked to the company's role in the deadly opioid epidemic in the United States. The privately owned firm has now admitted twice to illegally marketing opioid medications in a separate plea. Details with the Justice Department, once in 2007 and again last year. As part of those agreements, the pharmaceutical company acknowledged lying to doctors and patients about the safety of its product, oxycodone, which became the most widely abused prescription narcotics in the United States alone. The war on drugs has operated more effectively as a system of racial control to control a oppressed race of people than a mechanism for combating the use and trafficking of drugs, aka otherwise known as narcotics. The war on drugs has only caused pain and suffering and human rights violations, with mass incarceration based on race, based on class, based on poverty, etc., but of particularly people of color, mostly black people and indigenous people around the world. In the U.S., black people are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white people, with nearly half sentencing for drug-related crimes, non-violent drug-related crimes. In the United States, black people are more than 8 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the racist police system, forces than white people. Unfortunately, of these racist policies and policing on people of color, communities have unfortunately received little attention from mainstream media, aka capitalistic media, that is run by the imperialist capitalist pigs who just want to make, profits and money. In Australia, for example, Aboriginal, Native, Indigenous people only make up 3% of the entire Australia population. However, they make up a staggering 27% to 28% of the prison population in Australia. Racism also played a key role in the push for prohibition, as substances like opioids and cannabis were associated with Chinese and Mexican immigrants and African Americans, while cocaine was linked to black men who, according to the U.S. government propaganda, would either seduce white women with the lure of the substance or become violent under the influence of drugs. Systematizing certain substances and making their use seem deviant has served to demonize, dehumanize, and marginalize the communities who use them. This approach then justifies the use of harsh punishment against certain communities and ethnicities that vested interests seek to oppress. John Richmond, Nixon's assistant for domestic affairs, made a frank admission of this tactic in 1994. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be black or illegal, to be, a leftist. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin and cocaine, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. See, that's a mission of racism, and it's kind of the tactics the Nazis used, by censoring the left and discriminating against Jews and other people of color. This is one of the hugest reasons people are locked up in prison. Most of the people in prison are locked up, from, non-violent drug offenses, because the United States in particular is very, very known for this. Psychoactive substances have been widely used by humans all over the world for millennia and centuries. In pre-colonial Africa and much of pre-colonial Asia, cannabis was cultivated, traded, and used as a medicine. Opium poppy has a centuries-old history as a traditional medicine and for ceremonial use in Asia and the Middle East. Initially, colonial interests, as many parts of the world views these plants as important commodities to enrich their coffers. In particular, British, French, and Dutch colonial powers conducted lucrative trade by producing opium, coca, cannabis for export in their colonies in India, Bermuda, Indonesia, Morocco, and Algeria. The British famously won the Opium War of 1840 through 1842, in which enabled unfettered export of opium from British India to China. Early discussions on opium prohibition were resisted by Britain as they fought to protect their profitable opium trade. Cannabis was criminalized roughly a century ago through pressure from the capitalist pigs, like Big Pharma, because they were threatened by the both incredible versatility of the industrial hemp, and even 100 years ago, threatened by potential of cannabis as a natural remedy. Big Pharma aims to make money off the sick. There was a quote called, "Every patient cured is a customer loss." And that applies to Big Pharma because that's what they want to do. They want to keep you sick so then they can sell you the drugs, so they can make money because they're capitalist pigs, typical capitalism, typical, imperialism all over the world, yes. These Big Pharma companies created the opioid crisis, around the globe. Industry is a $1 trillion per year revenue generator in the world. The bulk of these revenues are controlled by a handful of capitalist pigs. In the 1980s, cannabis prohibition became even more extreme and irrational via the United States' war on drugs, aka war on black people and leftists. Suddenly, ultra-safe cannabis was equated with heroin as a dangerous drug. This is because the capitalist pigs want to make money. They don't like leftists. They don't like anti-capitalists. They don't like black people. They don't like people of color. Cannabis is a health-promoting substance. Big Pharma doesn't want people to be healthy. We already made that clear. Again, a quote. Big Pharma makes the most money by keeping people sick and even making them sicker. Often half of the prescription drug commercials is eaten up by disclaimers warning those desperate enough to take such drugs of a series of, horrible things that could happen, and the horrible side effects such as death or extreme liver function or whatever. That's just some examples. This brings us to Big Pharma's hatred of cannabis. The capitalist pigs hate cannabis for several important reasons. Because cannabis is a safe, natural substance found on this earth. It never makes people sicker. It's a natural plant. People prescribed cannabis medically never need to, add additional drugs to cure the cure. With its health-promoting properties, cannabis can help healthy people stay healthy. As already noted, Big Pharma makes no money from healthy people. Cannabis is not addictive. Taking cannabis as a medicine never leads to using cannabis as an addiction, unlike opioids, because cannabis is a natural substance with broad health promotion properties. Big Pharma can't sympathize and monopolize cannabis medicines via drug patients. The number one reason why Big Pharma hates cannabis is that because it knows it can't monopolize cannabis medications via patients and then gouge customers with excessive prices, which is what capitalism, the system, likes to do in the healthcare industry under any country that has capitalism. Capitalism causes this because capitalism sucks and because capitalism kills in the healthcare industry.
That black women feel less pain than white women is racist. Its origins are too. Let's talk about it. It all started in the 19th century when medical practitioners used to purchase enslaved black women and use them as guinea pigs for their experiments. The first well-known doctor to do this was Marion Sims. He performed genital surgery on black women repeatedly without anesthesia. He described his experiments as so painful that none but a woman could perform them. After these horrific experiments, he founded the first women's hospital, only for white and wealthy women. Despite these horrific experiments on black women, Sims is known as the father of gynecology. He even had a statue in New York. This was taken down due to protests.
Welcome to Terrible Things America Has Done, Part 3. From 1947 to 1948, John Charles Cutler carried out disgusting medical experiments on Guatemalans. Cutler was also one of the doctors responsible for the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. The experiments in Guatemala exposed 1,300 sex workers, inmates, soldiers, and psychiatric patients to STIs like syphilis and gonorrhea without their consent. Many of the victims were indigenous, and because of this, Cutler said he didn't feel like he needed to explain the experiments to them. Because he's a racist piece of trash. 83 people died because of these experiments. Spouses and children, many of whom have contracted these infections because of these experiments, have filed wrongful death lawsuits for loved ones passed because of this experiment. The U.S. has never paid compensation for this.
So on to the hell that is America's healthcare system, aka, pro-anarchist capitalism, healthcare system and the racist history, that goes along with it. Capitalism sucks. The United States healthcare is the perfect example of why capitalism sucks ass. It's an inhumane system, and it's inhumane. Its healthcare is also highly inhumane. Even inside the country, many people who live there say that the system sucks and doesn't work. It's also costly. Also, the history of it's racist. Back then they used to test on slaves and stuff against their will. They couldn't say no because they were slaves and stuff like that. Homeless dumping is another example. Homeless dumping is where a patient is dumped on the streets. It's a practice of hospitals and emergency services inappropriately releasing homeless or patients to public hospitals or on the streets instead of placing them with a homeless shelter or retaining them, especially when they may require extensive medical care with minimal government reimbursement from Medicare or Medicaid or Medicare. One widely reported horrific story of how bad the United States healthcare system was in 2018. There was a woman who got stuck in between the train and the platform on the Boston subway. She was injured so severely that the bone in her leg was exposed and it was broken, but still she pleaded to people and bystanders not to call an ambulance, and she quoted, "Do you know how much an ambulance costs?" She was quoted saying at the time, "Studies and statistics of it conclude that an ambulance bills can exceed $1,000 and occasionally even reach $2,000. Another example is abortions. You know that tool that opens up the uterus to take out the fetus or whatever? It actually costs, cost largely depends on insurance. Insured women can pay anywhere from $250 to $1,200, while those who are uninsured can be expected to pay somewhere between $4,000 and $9,000. Medical costs can also be added. Another victim of capitalism would be, COVID-19 victims, around the world, and how Bill Gates is, gatekeeping the vaccine. Another one, the Jennifer Halgic Kimmel was billed $950,000 after giving birth in the U.S. when she was on vacation in Hawaii. She said, "My water broke 2 days into our holiday. I spent 6 weeks on bed rest, and then the baby was delivered by emergency C-section December 10th. Reese and I had to stay in the hospital for over 2 months. They thought that their insurance would cover the almost $1 million U.S. bill, but in the end, the Blue Cross insurance company denied payment. In a letter to the family, a Blue Cross worker wrote, "We are unable to provide coverage for any medical expenses incurred for Miss Huckley's baby, and please note that Miss Huckley's travel policy expired on November 9th, 2013. Blue Cross said that because I had a bladder infection at 4 months and a hemorrhoid because of that, they would not cover the pregnancy," she said. "We thought we had done everything right. We thought we had covered all the avenues, and we thought we were covered. We thought we were safe to go." A third example of the victims of capitalism, for example, how these CEOs of pharmaceutical companies jack up the cost of like insulin, and there's people dying, from not getting, proper insulin, which are, is, a horrible thing. Another example of the victims of capitalism. There was a episode in the documentary Forensic Files called Breaking the Mold. A woman, Melinda Ballard, in 1999, she sued her insurance company over mold damage in her 22-room family home in Texas. The family seemed to live the perfect life until their 3-year-old son, Reese Allison, developed a respiratory condition in March 1999, and so later on, so did the whole entire family. Her husband later was shown to have 3rd-stage Alzheimer's and dementia disease. Like, he got so disoriented, and he couldn't remember where he parked in the parking lot. He went to go get groceries, and in the parking lot, he literally was out in the parking lot, I think, for 3 or 5 hours because he couldn't find his car. It took him that long to find his car, And there was an investigator that was on a plane that revealed that their ill health is due to a form of black mold. Their case started as a single claim for water damage, but because the insurance company wanted to check it all out and they were procrastinating, the mold got worse, and it turned into a case of mold contamination in the entire house. But you know how insurance companies don't want to pay anyone any money because they're capitalist pigs, they want to hoard all the money, etc. She and her husband, were awarded $32 million in 2001 as a result of the lawsuit, the farmer's insurance for mold and damage. The award was later changed to only $4 million. Capitalism is the cause of all this. Profits over lives every day. So if you guys like this video, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Bye guys, see you next video.